This is the Doing Business School Abroad podcast. I'm Ken Globerman, and if you're interested in going to business school somewhere out of your country, this is definitely the podcast series for you. This is episode 6, the Gmat Exam. Welcome back. This is Ken Globerman, founder of No Brainer. We're back with episode 6 of our podcast series. Today, we're going to talk about the Gmat exam. Now, the last podcast episode was about the GRE, so we're now going to talk about the Gmat and contrast it to the GRE exam. The Gmat exam, or the Graduate Management Admissions Test, is administered by an organization called the GMAC. You can find out more about the Gmat exam on the GMAC's website, mba.com. And this is the primary problem-solving, I call it problem-solving standardized test that business schools generally accept as part of the admissions process. Since the last 10, 15 years or so, or even maybe longer now, the Gmat exam has been delivered only via computer at testing centers around the world. There are thousands of testing centers across many, many different countries throughout the globe. And the test is delivered over 3.5 hours in what's called the computer adaptive format, or it is known as, in fact, a computer adaptive test, or CAT. And what that basically means, and it's something really unique about the Gmat, what that means is that everybody who's taking the Gmat exam does not see the same questions. Basically, when you sit down and start the exam, whatever section you're starting with, whether it be the math or the quantitative or the verbal section, you are served up a question, usually of moderate difficulty, and then whether you get the question right or wrong changes the level of difficulty of the subsequent questions. So basically, the test adapts to you. As you get questions correct, actually the questions get harder, and you will end up at a higher score. If you get lots of questions incorrect, you will be served easier questions, and you will end up with a lower score. Now, stepping back for a second, the Gmat has 4 sections. The 2 sections that people seem to care the most about are the quantitative and verbal sections. Each of those are 75 minutes, and the last 2 sections are 30 minutes each. One is known as the AWA, or the Analytical Writing Assessment, and the fourth one is Integrated Reasoning. So I'll do a little bit of a deep dive on each of those sections. Let me just mention a couple of other general points about the exam before I do that. First of all, scoring. So each of the quantitative and verbal sections, those 2 longer sections I mentioned, are scored 0 to 60, but then the test administrator combines those scores into a weighted score that ranges from 200 to 800. So that's the score that people and schools seem to care the most about, that 200 to 800 weighted score. And generally speaking, the sort of average or median score sort of falls into the low to mid 500s, with about a 600 score considered a good score, or let's call it a sort of the beginning of a distinguished score. A 650, I would say, is a very good score, and a 700, which is about the 89th percentile or so these days, is considered the beginning of an exceptional score. And today, if you get in the 750 or 760 range, you're in that kind of 98th, 99th percentile which is the obviously score that distinguishes yourself in the highest way. I don't think I've met someone who scored 800 on the GMAT, though I'm sure that there are a few of those people out there as well. On the GMAT exam, because it's adaptive, you can't skip questions. You can't go back and change answers. There's no formal break in the exam. Between those 4 sections, there are 2 optional 8-minute breaks. You don't get to use a calculator for the quant section, but on the integrated reasoning section, there is an on-screen calculator. You can schedule the test at a testing center all year round. You just need to make an appointment. And I will also leave you with the fact that you basically can't bring anything into the testing room. So if you have any food or smartwatch, cell phone, all that stuff gets left outside of the testing room in a locker. And you can't even bring your writing apparatus, paper, pens, pencils, into the testing room. The testing center provides you with pencils and paper to take notes on. So those are the general high-level points about the GMAT exam as a test. Let's talk a little bit about the sections. So the analytical writing section, I mentioned the AWA, is essentially a 30-minute section where you're provided a situation, or essentially what it is someone's point of view, and then you're asked to analyze it, essentially, right? Analyze their premise and conclusion, and then provide some weak points in their premise and conclusion as you may find them, and some recommendations on how to make their conclusion stronger. So it's highly analytical in nature. The test is not looking for your use of expansive vocabulary, but really good, clear, logical business English. There's no real limit to the number of words that you have to, minimum or maximum, that you should have on the page. But generally, people write between 250 and 350 words for their AWA response. As I mentioned, this is scored, I actually don't think I mentioned it. The AWA is scored on a 0 to 6 scale in half-point increments, and a good score is considered about 4, let's say, starting from 3.5 to 4. A 3.5 to 4 kind of puts you in the 50th percentile. The second section I'll mention is the integrated reasoning section. It's that second 30-minute section. And this is a section that's really kind of like a math section, but it's really more of a data and graphical interpretation section. So here, you're given a series of 12 questions, and you're asked, some of them may be multi-part, however, and you're asked to interpret information that's provided to you. And what makes this hard is you've got to be able to interpret that quickly. So in order to prepare for this section, you want to start really reviewing lots of graphs, charts, whether they be pie charts, org charts, line graphs, bar charts, scatter plots, all kinds of stuff like that to build your speed and accuracy in generally interpreting information that's presented to you. You're presented then questions about those graphs and charts and whatnot, right? So that's kind of how that section works. You don't have to do a lot of mathematical calculations. There may be some, but they're not high-level math computations. So that's the second section. The third section I'll talk about is the verbal section. And the verbal section, which I mentioned already, is 75 minutes. Basically has 3 types of questions that you need to be able to deal with. The first is your typical reading comprehension type of question, where you're given a reading passage. The GMAT exam really likes science passages, so you want to get skilled at being able to read and digest science passages about topics that you probably have no expertise on, to be able to understand the main idea and the gist of things when you're presented with new material. You also will get, besides science, some business passages and other types of humanities-oriented passages. Those are generally the topics you'd expect to read about, and the questions are your typical reading comprehension questions. Usually they're asking about the general main point, detailed questions, so you have to go back to the passage and actually get the information from the passage itself, or probably the hardest type of question, an inference question, where you need to understand the passage well enough to infer what the author was thinking or what the author was feeling, which is a little more intangible than a typical detail or main idea question. The second type of question would be sentence correction questions. So sentence correction exercises, really what they do is present you with a sentence with an underlined portion that may or may not be written in a grammatically correct format, and you're presented with 5 answer choices, one of which may be better than the original one presented to you in the original sentence, right? So for example, if you had the sentence, "This boy are old," and the word "are" was underlined, obviously "are" is incorrect, and the answer choices might be choice A, "are," choice B, "is," choice C, "they," choice D, something else, and choice E, something else. Obviously "is" fits the best there, and that would be the answer choice you would choose. So you're basically looking to write the most grammatically correct sentence you can from the answer choices provided. The third type of question is your critical reasoning question, and this really, in this question, you're given a 2 to 3 sentence premise and conclusion, and it's testing your ability to cut through the logic of someone's argument and understand where there are weak points in that. So you may get a question, you may read about someone's point of view about, I don't know, abortion or anti-smoking laws, and then you may get a question like, which of the following would best support the author's argument? And then what you'll need to do there is determine which of the 5 answer choices, if true, would best support the conclusion the author's making in the question above. So that's your critical reasoning question type. So that's your 3 question types in your verbal side of the exam. On the quant side of the exam, you have your typical multiple choice math questions, 5 answer choices, solve the math problem. Most of us have taken tests like that. And you have then something unique to the GMAT, data sufficiency, where you're provided a question stem and 2 pieces of information where you need to determine which of those 2, if any, data statements would help you answer the question stem. Okay? So those are your 2 question types. From a theory perspective, on the GMAT, you can expect to see arithmetic, number properties, algebra, geometry, probability, data analysis, set theory, combinatorics, which is really your ability to deal with combinations and permutations, and a few other kind of oddball type questions. What's really important about doing well on the GMAT exam is not only your understanding of math and English theory, but also your ability to develop test-taking strategy. Because on this exam, you have limited time to answer each question, and often to get through the entire exam, you need back-of-the-envelope type of skill sets in order to answer certain questions quickly. What might that look like? For example, using the answer choices and backing into the question, or using estimation and approximation theory, which helps you kind of ballpark the answer without doing specific rigorous calculations. On the English side of the exam, the ability to cut through the gist or main idea of a passage very quickly, or your ability to hone in on the logic or argument that someone presents so that you can understand where there are weak points in their premise and conclusions. So those are just at a very high level some of the strategy techniques that you'd want to learn to adapt in taking the GMAT exam. So obviously, this is something that I'm very passionate about because I've been doing GMAT prep personally since I was in business school myself, and prior to that doing SAT prep for Kaplan, which is a big multinational test prep company where I started in 1993. So this is something near and dear to my heart. And of course, No Brainer was built fundamentally on providing GMAT preparation to students in countries like Poland, where English is not the native language. So to summarize, we talked about the GMAT exam today. It's really important that you spend quality time preparing for it. Both the GMAT and GRE, I recommend to my students to take 10 to 12 minimum weeks of preparation. Sort of 10 to 15 hours a week is like the general amount of time I like to recommend to the average student. Of course, there are people who can study in a month and study for 5 hours a week and do very well. So there's no one answer, but that's my general answer: 10 to 12 weeks and 10 to 15 hours per week. We talked about the exam structure. We talked about the exam scoring. We talked about the theory that you can expect on the exam. And we finally talked about some of the test-taking strategy that you want to work on when preparing. I guess the last thing I'll say is it's important that you get your hands on the official guide to the GMAT, which is something that's published by the test makers themselves. So I'm a big believer in getting the official guide. So that should be part of your study, but not all-encompassing. You also want to get your hands on some other theory books as you need. If you find that there are certain gaps in your theory, whether they be English, grammar, idioms, geometry, or algebra, or something else. And finally, you want to work on test strategy. And for that, I can recommend a couple of companies. I like Manhattan Prep very much. I have my students buying some of their materials. There are other companies out there like Magoosh. I'll just plug a few of them. Kaplan, Princeton Review, and of course you can work through programs like No Brainer's program, where we develop custom programs where we leverage materials by a number of different companies and some of our own proprietary material to actually help prepare our students. So make sure you get the proper help that you need to succeed on that exam. So I think that's it for this podcast. I hope this was helpful for you. I hope you got some good information on getting through your GMAT preparation part of your journey to business school. And on that note, I will pause and we'll end this podcast series. The next in our series will focus on another important element as you begin the application process. It's going to be your writing samples, or the essays that the schools are going to ask you to write. And every school has different essay questions that they may ask you to respond to. So it's a really cool topic and a very creative one. So tune in to episode 7 next. And on that note, I'll wish you a farewell. This is Ken Globerman signing off, episode 6 of this podcast series. Have a wonderful day. Take care.